Assalamu alaikum and welcome. In this series I've been talking about men and women and specifically the relationship between us and how this might be understood from a cultural perspective but also from an Islamic perspective, and how the Islamic perspective beautifies our relationships and supports the healthy living of men and of women. But what's interesting and often very sad is that the image of Islam has been tainted by us as Muslims and our practices and our individual problems and situations. And something I'd like to talk today is about violence and about victimization. The Western stereotype, or one of the Western stereotypes about Islam, is that it oppresses women in very brutal ways. All the way through, from restricting movements, restricting rights, but also brutalizing the female body. And we have an interesting and very disturbing phenomenon in Western Europe at the moment, where the politics of the far right, where fascists, where neo-Nazis are actually recruiting people who are creating a lot of noise by using the image of Muslim women. In particular, they use the idea that Islam and Muslim men abuse Muslim women and that Muslim women are victims of violence. So we have rallies where neo-Nazis hold pictures of hijabi women with blood on their face. We have videos, for example, the fitna video, which was featured even within the UK, within the Netherlands, and on the internet, that tried to cast Islam as directly encouraging and being responsible for the victimization of women and violence against women. And then we have certain spokespeople who talk about their own experience of abuse as Muslims, and how their abuse within their families was again as a direct result of their family being Muslim, of having experienced Muslim societies. So there's a lot of voice out there that's very negative and talks about this victimization. So what do we mean by victimization? So traditionally, from a sociological perspective, we've had this idea that there are perpetrators and there are victims. And the victim is the one that experiences the form of crime. Now, when it comes to violence, and particularly violence against women, the idea of victimhood, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And it becomes complicated because it often starts to utilize the image of women within a particular culture or society, and sometimes suggests that women are either bringing upon themselves the victimization or are somehow naturally inclined towards being victims. And this relates to some of the discussions we've had previously about men and women and the nature of men and women. So this idea that somehow men are very physical and strong and inclined or even encouraged to punish women, and that women are somehow weak or in need of control or attract the negative attention of men. So within this idea and within this dynamic, it's as if women are natural victims, that our weakness or our bad behaviour brings on the victimization, and that we are therefore always in this cycle of violence and always going to be the ones who are abused in this way. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about our cultural constructions of victimization, and this is across all cultures and across all traditions, is that somehow victims are deserving of their situation, and that they are somehow complicit in the crimes against them. And this often comes in terms of women asking for it. The idea of domestic violence, for example, that by arguing with a husband, a woman is asking for it in terms of being beaten, or that if a woman wears particular clothes and goes out into the street, that somehow she is to blame for people attacking her or not being able to control their desires or victimizing her. And all the way through to rape victims, in all our countries, we see rape victims being blamed for the crime that has been committed against them, that they were in the wrong place or they were behaving in a way that attracted to the attention, which fundamentally misunderstands these kind of crimes, that they're not necessarily about the physical sexuality, but they tend to be about power and domination. And actually, victims have not brought crimes upon themselves. It is the responsibility of perpetrators. So how does this relate to Muslims and the Islamic framework and how we navigate through these problems? Is it all about individuals and individuals behaving in bad ways? Some bad people do bad things. Or is it relating more widely to some of our understandings of Islam or understandings of culture that actually encourage these negative relationships? And I would argue that unfortunately we can sometimes try and use Islam or our cultures to try and justify behaviour that is unjustifiable. So one of the sort of background issues that I think we need to talk about more as communities is the way that our norms, and particularly our cultural norms, set the scene. So often we have ideas that a certain kind of behaviour is expected, particularly of women, but also of men, that we have to conform to certain standards or certain expectations, and that those of us who do not conform with those expectations are putting themselves in danger or are somehow in needing of punishment. And therefore that kind of judgmental and very controlling understanding of what is considered good or bad or normal becomes a way of justifying crimes against certain people. Again, so we have high rates of violence against men who are considered effeminate. If someone judges someone not to be walking correctly or wearing particular kinds of clothes, somehow violence against them is justified. Similarly, if a woman is seen to be walking in a certain way, because she is not conforming to an expectation, does that mean that somehow she is her victimhood is justified, and that she's not the ideal victim? She is somehow someone deserving of that kind of lawlessness and punishment. We also have the situation of what we might call hypersexualization, and we see this in some of our more traditional concepts and contemporary times as well. So, for example, the idea of, and I've talked about it before, this idea of fitna, and that women are somehow causes of division between men and women because of their beauty or because of the dangerous attraction that they pose for men. This is a kind of hypersexualization of people, of not seeing people as human beings, but as bodies and objects. And what's interesting is we see this reflected in contemporary and particularly Western societies, but globally now, is this idea that women are objects, that women can be used to sell goods, that a partially clothed body can be used to sell a car or advertise for music, or be used in these kind of objectifying ways. And by making people, reducing people into these kind of objects who are just about physical beauty, we again set the scene for violence. We set the scene for making people less human. We start justifying certain actions as connected to these kind of behaviours and kind of norms. So we have these instances of violence and gender-based violence out in the public space where victims, usually women but also men, are somehow blamed for the violence that happens to them because they've behaved in a way that isn't expected of our particular community or culture. And then we have perhaps what we ordinarily think of as domestic violence, and that is violence within our families, within our homes, sometimes between men and women, but also between parents, siblings, grandparents, any form of relationship within the family. And of course, domestic violence and related issues happen in all of our communities, all cultures and all religions. Well, not within the religion, but within those of different religious backgrounds. So what is it that is really triggering these things, and how, as Muslims, can we respond to it? In particular, the idea of religious sanctioning of beating. We see the physical violence enacted upon wives by men who seek to justify their actions as somehow religiously sanctioned, when of course this is something very abhorrent to, you know, any kind of good relationship. Violence against anyone is wrong in this domestic context. Similarly, just not about physical abuse, but about economic abuse, the restriction of someone's access to money, to being able to go out, to be able to buy things, to their right of independent inheritance and independent wealth, is often used in this violent form of domestic abuse. And we have other forms of a kind of social abuses where shame and fear is used to control people. So whereas physical violence leaves outward scars, the kind of emotional and psychological scars of emotional abuse, where people are meant to feel guilty or bad about themselves, or are expected to behave in certain ways because of a generalized fear about people disapproving of them or hating them or rejecting them, are also forms of very unhealthy gender relations and familial relations and wider social relations. An example of this social and emotional kind of abuse is also related to one of the prevalent problems that we have in our communities, which centres around forced marriage. And this isn't just about the forced marriage of girls, but also the forced marriage of boys. And the idea that, yes, culturally often and even religiously sometimes, it is very beneficial for families to be involved in the marriage and the choosing of marriage partners. Not necessarily, but there is room within our tradition for that. What happens when that is extended and that the rights of the parents become dominant over the rights of individuals to marry who they wish is an extremely dangerous angle. And we have therefore young men and young women being bullied into marriages that are ultimately doomed to fail because of the lack of choice and the lack of compatibility between the two people, but also extreme examples where families so enthralled by social pressure or the concept of honour or pride commit acts of violence, even to the point of murder, of their own daughters and sons in order to perpetuate these marriages or to save face. And that's always quite something extraordinary. If we take a step back and look at the perspective, and from a religious perspective, you know, where is on the spectrum of important things the right of someone to choose their own life partner or you know, intimate partner? with that of people's social embarrassment or expectations. So please join me after the break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break, I was discussing the importance of understanding victimization, and particularly the dynamics, not only between men and women, but within our communities about violence, and sometimes the acceptance or even promotion of violence that we commit in trying to justify our actions or trying to dominate our family members or even strangers in the street, and the absolute negative effect that this has not only on us as individuals and on our our spiritual and social state, but more widely the way that our societies function. And part of this conversation that can't be avoided is the subject of sexual violence. In previous episodes, I've spoken about the political use of sexual violence, and in particular rape against women, but also against men, also in the use of torture, and why that happens, and in particular the way that that is linked to shame and the use of shame to control people. When someone feels embarrassed and when there are taboos around a subject and people don't talk about it, and these kind of issues are often swept under the carpet and seen as taboo and something that we shouldn't talk about, and by not talking about it, it gives these subjects power, and therefore violence of a sexual nature becomes a very effective weapon. It becomes an effective weapon in war, but it also becomes an effective weapon between a husband and a wife, or a man and a woman in a street or within our societies. So the fear of violence, the fear of sexual violence, can become very controlling. Often we talk about, and this again isn't just a Muslim problem, the idea that there is no such thing as consent in a marriage, and that sexual violence cannot conceptually exist because a man and a woman might be married. But of course, logically speaking, this isn't true. And any kind of forcing of any kind of violence in these contexts is extremely negative and damaging, not only for the victim, but also for the perpetrator and what that makes that person become, and the kind of twisting of norms and the twisting of actions, so that acts that are abhorrent become something that is done on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. So it's something that, despite our discomfort with the conversations, needs to be addressed, and we need to really challenge it within our families, within our communities, within our societies, because not only is it damaging to the particular individual victims, but it infects us all as communities. In the Western context, and continuing this more sort of controversial area, particularly around sexual violence and sexuality, is the increasing linking with Islam. It's happening in the UK, but across Europe, with sexual exploitation and the grooming of young people, and even paedophilia. And while, of course, all these kind of crimes and behaviours are, across the board, they're across culture, across class, across all groups, what is particularly disturbing is the way that it is being used by non-Muslims, but also by Muslims, to harm Islam. In particular, the idea that somehow Islam promotes these behaviours. So we have, on the one hand, non-Muslim media, for example, the political rhetoric of European countries talking about not only the oppression of women generally within Islam, but of the accusation that Islam somehow encourages the sexual activity with children, or the general sexual abuse of women, not only within our Muslim communities, but also that somehow we can justify abuse of non-Muslim women by Muslim men, and that that's somehow a characteristic of the Islamic framework, and that Sharia allows that to happen. So when we have crimes committed in countries where Muslims are a minority, and a crime is committed by a Muslim man of a sexual nature against a non-Muslim woman, again, this is being cast as something that Islam has encouraged the man, and that this is somehow something that Muslim men are not only inclined to do, but are supported by the religion. So we have that kind of very negative and appalling stereotype that also we can trace back historically, the kind of fascination of Orientalist Westerners with Muslim behaviours and their perceived, historically the perception that Islam was far too liberal between men and women, all the way up to contemporary times where suddenly Islam is seen as this sexually abusive religion, and that Muslim men in particular are sexually abusive individuals. But we also have our own houses to clear out, and sadly we have a small number, but nevertheless any number is a problem, of people who justify these kind of behaviours by saying, well, yes, Islam does allow this to happen, and again using the example of the Prophet ﷺ and his marriage to Aisha as a younger person, and conflating betrothal with marriage, all the way up to the idea that somehow women are objects, or that non-Muslim women are somehow objects who can be exploited because they are lesser beings, or somehow fair game because they're not Muslim. So we have these kind of mentalities which are actually encouraging abusive relationships and criminal activities within our communities that are so shocking to the majority of any right-thinking person, that it becomes, a very difficult subject to unpick and address. But it is absolutely something that we must not shy away from, and work with each other, work within our families, teach our boys and girls about healthy sexual relationships that don't promote a mythology and damaging relations between men and women. Because if our youth don't understand what a healthy relationship looks like, and if they're surrounded by the kind of imagery and attitudes in broader society, I mean, the things that we can see on the internet, or the kind of programs that are available on television, on satellite, these kind of imagery that are bombarding all of us, but particularly are influential and accessible by young people, that's out there. And so we can, hide from it and pretend it's not happening, but ultimately it's affecting our communities and our forms of criminality and all of these issues. So as uncomfortable as it is, it's something that I think we really need to start addressing actively and with confidence. So how might we better improve our situations and improve our behaviours and support the more beautiful relations between men and women from the Islamic perspective? Well, there's plenty of evidence and plenty of tools from within our tradition. And of course, there's the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, his behaviour with his own family, his behaviour with his wives, his absolute respect of women, his non-violence towards women, his equality and beauteous way of interacting. That is, of course, our benchmark as human beings of how to behave. But we also have other tools within the religion that are helpful in challenging some of these difficult issues. When it comes to issues of sexual exploitation and violence, for example, the shyness that we can often happen can be regulated or dispersed by the underlying principle that, in Islam, we don't shy away from questions, we ask questions. Aisha always gave examples, radiallahu anha, of women who were shy to ask questions around these issues, but who overcame their shyness in order to learn more about the deen. And the fear of God over the fear of embarrassment, helped them and supported them to address these issues. And so if we can recalibrate our interests, not in embarrassment or social pressure, but in what is best for us as Muslims and as human beings within our Islamic framework, that is something extremely powerful. And of course, always returning to the underlying principles of understanding that for men, the believer is who is pious is also, good to his wife. The woman who loves her husband and respects him and honours him, and he respects her and honours her. This kind of really beautifying of relationships, rather than the insidious, power-laden, very sort of negative way that we see. So hopefully I've addressed some of these difficult issues, particularly around victimisation and violence, but also to sketch out that framework that Islam, the power that Islam brings to changing our situation. It changed our very early communities, and it can continue changing us now for the better. So please join me for the next episode, and thank you, and Assalamu alaikum.